As a quick introduction, I just want to give you a quick travel story, what not to do. So on the West Coast right now, we're experiencing El Nino, which is a major storm system. I flew out of San Francisco yesterday. And here, you've got freezing rain, which I guess is called snow. So yesterday, my flight was supposed to go Denver to Moline. It got delayed out of San Francisco airport until I got to the point where I thought, this flight's just not going to happen. So I flew direct to Chicago, landed somewhere just before midnight, picked up the last all-wheel drive rental at Hertz, and then drove out. So there was, that part of the plan made a lot of sense because I was on West Coast time zone, so still wide awake. Where this could have all gone terribly awry, and you could have been reading about your speaker this morning in the police notes, is my older sister and Dr. Keene as well had kindly offered to let me stay at their place last night. I have never been to their place. Turns out their address has a matching address that's somewhere else in town. And my older sister had generously said, we'll leave the light on for you and I'll leave the front door unlocked. So at 2:45 in the morning, I pulled up in front of a house and I was a little tired, had a cup of coffee from the DeKalb Oasis, and I thought, there's something that doesn't look right. Like, I haven't been to my sister's house, but I just don't think this is it. And discretion is the better part of valor. And at the last minute, I went to Google Maps and looked at the actual address, and I thought, I'm a minute away from trying to break into someone's house. So I backtracked, snowy footsteps, went to the car, drove to the right place, and got there home. So the journey went fine. Didn't get as much sleep as I had planned last night. So if you disagree with something I said, just blame it on the fatigue, and if you like what I said, it was part of the presentation. So let's kick this off. Here we go. So just a quick overview on some of the things we're going to talk about. I'm going to run through a bunch of big trends in our industry. We're not going to be able to get through all of them in 45 minutes. And I want to spend some time on question and answers just to be helpful to you if you have questions about sustainability, technology, careers as well. So a couple things I'll run through, just a really quick intro in terms of my story, how I got to do what I'm doing now. Talk about the topic of urbanization, which I think is the most important driver in terms of sustainability. And I think in terms of social justice, you should be thinking along the lines of urbanization as well. Urbanization and transportation are twin problems. When you talk about problems in urbanization, you're always talking about related problems in transportation, vice versa. Let's talk about sustainable technology a little bit, the opportunity to use some of these talents we have, some of this technology to actually solve problems. Tie sustainability back to social justice. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about this in the context of social justice? And then finally, end with some thoughts on careers with impact. Whether you go into an environmental technology field, into technology at all, if there's one thing I can impress upon you today, it's just make sure you invest your career in something that matters to you. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. You've got a lot of career ahead of you. It won't all be one thing, and you're all going to have a lot of impact, so make sure it goes in the right direction. So just a quick background on me, as my sister reminded me to mention, I'm a liberal arts graduate from the College of William & Mary. I did a BBA in finance and a minor in history, and I will say the 4 years I spent at William & Mary in college, that is where I became educated. Went on to business school, spent 4 years in the Army, but the place that I really learned to think critically, logically, experienced a lot of diversity was at William & Mary in a liberal arts program. So for those of you, regardless of what field you're going into, getting a strong general education, learning how to think for yourself, learning logic, fairness, it's an incredibly important investment of your time. Started working on sustainability really full-time with a biofuels company, and then moved over to Tesla Motors in 2007. I was one of the earlier employees at Tesla. I think it was something like 164, 165. And it was a pretty rough 3 years. We were building the company during the Great Recession, so twice we made it to 200 headcount, and then we dropped back down. So it was a tough period of time. It was the best education I could have gotten in terms of building a startup. After working on the IPO for Tesla, moved over to Kleiner Perkins, which is a venture capital firm. A venture capital firm or a VC funds technology startups. So I went from the operating side to 4 years on the funding side. And after 4 years at Kleiner Perkins, I joined the management team as the CEO of one of Kleiner Perkins' startups called Proterra, which, as I'll explain to you, is doing a Tesla-like technology, but for the mass transit industry. So the thing I'm the most happy about is for the last 10 years I've gotten to work on things that I care about. Whether it was Tesla Motors or working with the green companies or the clean tech companies within Kleiner Perkins Fund, I've gotten the luxury of supporting companies that I believe in. And I think that's probably the most important thing about the last 10 years of my career. I look back and I'm really proud of the companies that I've gotten to work with. So jumping on to urbanization. This is something that I really didn't spend too much time thinking about at Tesla Motors, but spent a lot of time studying once I moved over to Kleiner Perkins and started investing more broadly in startup companies. Growing up, and even today, cities aren't necessarily the place I want to spend my free time. I'm very much a naturalist, love being outside, so in some ways I'm not an urbanist in terms of where I want to spend my free time, but what I've learned is urbanization is the most important demographic trend, and it's the only hope we have in terms of sustainability. Somewhat counterintuitive, because if you go to a city, you're just bombarded by the impact of human development. But it turns out that when we live close together and we live in cities, our energy consumption and our carbon per person is much lower. And cities are the most productive economic unit we have. They're also the places where you're going to get the most economic specialization, you're going to get your best human rights, women's rights, security, and you're going to have the most dynamic societies. So cities are incredibly important, and they've never been more important. A couple years ago, for the first time in human history, 50% of human beings were living in urban areas as opposed to rural or suburban, and this is accelerating. So by 2050, 3/4 of the Earth's population will live in cities. And to put this in perspective in terms of mobility, 1 million people a week are moving out of rural areas and are moving into cities. This is primarily happening in the developing world, but we're even seeing it in the US. To put that into perspective in terms of what that means in terms of new urban areas, that's an urban area the size of Chicago built out every month. So that's how quickly we are becoming an urban planet. This is very important though. The only way we're going to protect the natural resources we have and get more efficient in how we use energy, water, waste, is if we live closer together. The suburban and the rural model, they do not scale, and you can see that in China right now. The more China tries to copy 1960s America, the more unsustainable the situation gets. So very, very important. And whether you're thinking about the environment, technology, or social justice, I'd encourage you to think about how things work in cities, because if it doesn't work in a city, it really doesn't matter. This trend cannot be reversed. The reason is this is where people want to be. In the developing world, this is about safety, security, education. You're not going to turn around this tide. So urbanization, incredibly important. And in the US, as I mentioned, it's happening here as well. You can see there's this little dip in the chart here where the US flatlined in urbanization during the 1960s and 1970s. That was driven by social issues we were having, and also the ability to take advantage of a free highway system that was built in the 1950s, but really wasn't at capacity. Today, though, that highway system is at capacity. We're behind in investing in infrastructure, and thankfully, we've overcome some of the social issues that caused populations to bifurcate. So it's all reversing today. A lot of you, when you graduate, you're going to end up moving to a city. Your friends are already there, and a lot of the best jobs are in cities. Now, cities aren't just New York City and LA and San Francisco. This is Nashville, this is Louisville, this is Atlanta and Charlotte. A lot of the fastest growing, the fastest urbanizing regions in the country are not necessarily your headline cities. They're cities that are 200,000 people now, but they're going to be 800,000 people in a couple of decades. So you combine that with transportation, and this is an incredibly exciting era for how urbanization and transportation are changing. I've spent the last 10 years in terms of sustainability working on mobility. The problem that concerns me the most is the oil problem, the fact that even today, you can't move a piece of cargo, you can't travel by aircraft, you can't move a ship, you can't move a car without using petroleum. There are some other alternative fuels out there, but for the most part, they're around in Europe. If we interrupted the supply of petroleum coming out of the Middle East right now, our economy would stop. So this is a classic sustainability issue. We keep doing things the way we're doing, and we're headed for trouble. The neat thing is you combine mobile, internet technology, and urbanization, and everything's changing. Places like Detroit, Germany, Japan, where they build a lot of cars, they're very concerned about what you're doing with cars. Your generation is getting your driver's license a little bit later. You don't value a car from a social status perspective as much as your parents or your grandparents did. You value being online, you value being connected. So your opportunity cost of sitting behind the wheel and driving from a suburb to your job is higher than it's ever been. So your behaviors are changing. And I grabbed this slide out of one of our presentations for our boards, and we were just explaining how our product fits in what we call a transportation gap. You've got on-demand services like Uber, Lyft, bicycles on one side, with high capacity like rail on the other, and you have buses falling in the middle. So everything's changing in transportation: autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, ride sharing, Uber, Lyft. But it's not necessarily going to create fairness or equality if we don't think about it more proactively. So why does transportation matter from a social justice perspective? Transportation is one of the essentials. It's one of the greatest luxuries we can have. If you look at a developing economy, if you look at Japan after World War II, Germany after World War II, the first three things they wanted were cars, color TV, air conditioning, the three C's. Mobility in this country in a lot of ways has defined freedom. So we have groups of people who have a lot of freedom, who fly where they want, drive where they want, and we have groups of people who are stuck. And if you are stuck in one place and a company or an industry moves, you're going to create a pocket of sustained poverty. This is just a simple map of Chicago, and what it shows is jobs that you can get to without owning a car effectively. Now this is good news if you've got communities living in a city and you've got jobs in a city. But everything's changing right now, and urbanization is driving people back into cities. It's driving up the value of cities, and it's driving lower income families out of cities. So the problem's somewhat changing. Over the last couple of decades, we've worried a lot about pockets of urban poverty. It's just a prediction, but the future challenge may be more about suburban and rural poverty. Cities are relatively easy to serve with infrastructure. Uber and Lyft are happy to serve Chicago or New York. It's harder to figure out what to do with these small communities, especially when they were tied to a single industry. Industries move very fast, communities do not. And so transportation is the linkage that can fix that. Bottom line is it's easier to move people to jobs than it is to move jobs to people. And if you don't provide any infrastructure, you're creating a fairness problem. The people who have the most wealth, which is legacy assets, and the most income, which is what they make on a day-to-day basis, those are the people who are going to get to those jobs first, and so you're going to just continue to perpetuate that unfairness. So within the context of transportation, transit has never been more important. This is exciting, again, driven by your generation. You have different views about transit than your parents and your grandparents. You don't mind taking the train, you don't mind taking the bus, you don't mind figuring out how to use an app on your phone to summon a car. We're seeing this in the numbers in terms of consumption. So a lot of people taking a lot of transit. Here's the problem with transit though. On a legacy basis, transit means more fossil fuel combustion. And transit vehicles are the least fuel efficient vehicles on the road. Bulldozers, construction equipment, tanks, those are a little bit less efficient than transit buses, but your typical transit bus only gets 4 miles to the gallon. So that's 1/4 of a gallon of diesel fuel burned in the urban core every mile that you go. So I think it's pretty conclusive that we're going to have more cities. More cities drives more transit. More transit could mean more pollution. So just shifting people from one type of vehicle to another isn't going to do anything about what is a massive environmental problem we have with powering our transportation economy with fossil fuels. And these are big numbers, 400 million gallons of diesel fuel. Volkswagen just did a great job a couple months ago of highlighting the dangers of diesel fuel emissions. And I think as time goes on, there'll be less and less tolerance of emitting diesel fuel in particular, near where we live, near where our kids go to school. So then if you pull up at a high level, I would say your biggest environmental justice problem and one of the largest social justice problems the world will be dealing with on a national level, on a state level, is climate change. Climate change does not penalize fairly. It's not going to come across the board and tax every economy. in the same way. Some countries are going to be underwater. Some countries are going to have more arable land for farming. So it gives and it takes away. For the most part, it's going to be a very bad thing. We may be entering the first human-driven age of extinction. And you can see from this chart, former boss of mine, Elon Musk, he refers to this as the dumbest experiment in human history. Scientists don't actually know what happens when we spike atmospheric CO2 levels to these levels. A couple years ago, there was or it still exists, but there's a not-for-profit, 350.org. 350 because we're going to try to hold CO2 to 350 parts per million. We're already at 400 a day, and you can see on a long time scale how quickly human beings figured out how to use fossil fuel, and then how quickly they started burning it like crazy and emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere than anyone's ever seen on a measured scale. So this is just simple temperature trend. It is cold today in Moline, that's weather. This is climate. This is why in California, despite a lot of rain, we're still in the middle of a huge drought. I try to keep this non-controversial, but climate change for some reason is a scientific topic that has become very politicized. And to break it down into three very simple schools of thought, I group it into three things. You have scientists and you have people who don't really have an economic interest in biasing climate change one way or another. So they study the problem scientifically and they determine that CO2 causes CO2 causes a greenhouse gas effect, we're emitting more CO2, there is human-caused climate change. So category one, people who understand climate change. Category two, companies and individuals that understand climate change but have a political or a profit motive to delay the understanding of climate change or action on that. A great example of that is the recent discovery that ExxonMobil has known about climate change for decades. So they are very smart scientists, and they knew and understood climate change, but they made a corporate decision to delay any sort of action on it, and instead to lobby to delay regulation. Then you have a third category of thought on climate change, which is people who have been delayed or confused by category two. So as you think about climate change, whether it's in a social justice perspective or in a technology perspective, just think about those three categories. You either understand climate change, you have a motivation to delay the understanding of climate change, or you have been delayed by category two. At least in category two, you know what's going on. Category three, though, you're definitely, something else is obfuscating you. You can do a lot of research on this. This presentation is not to convince you of climate change. If you don't understand climate change, learn about it, especially your generation. The reason I say that is because your generation is it. If we don't figure this out, my kids will not have time, certainly my kids' won't have time to figure out what to do. They will be studying this as a historical problem. Why didn't we do more? So if this is a question for you, just learn about it. That's what you're here for. You got 4 years to figure this stuff out. To localize this, Proterra builds electric buses in South Carolina. We have a technology center in Northern California, and we're building a factory in Southern California. It tends to be easier to understand how serious climate change is when you put it on a local level. This was just in the last year. So this photo of the flood here in South Carolina, this was taken by the daughter of one of my engineers in South Carolina. And in the same year, while South Carolina was experiencing a 1 in 1,000 year flood, California was in the middle of a 1 in 1,000 year drought. So this is a photo of one of the fires that leveled a town in Northern California. Because of where I live, this is a very local problem. And we had a family who had a dad who was a firefighter out working on this type of problem. So I don't know what climate change means for your area, but it will change things, and it will likely change things for the worse. What is it caused by? It's caused by carbon emissions. And one of the really challenging things about what's going on in the energy ecosystem right now is that we are using more oil than ever before, and the emissions per barrel of oil is going up. So the era of easy oil is over. Easy oil is the Beverly Hillbillies, drill a hole in the ground and up comes the crude oil. Oil today, the new sources of production like tar sands in Canada, this is a photo of tar sands, or deep water extraction in the Gulf, it's incredibly energy intensive. So it means you're using energy to get energy out. That's not the case for a place like Saudi Arabia, where they have large oil fields. very low cost of production. But this is the way we're growing oil production in North America. From a social justice perspective, this is an interesting issue. Someone lived here. This is someone's community. Energy production has never been more energy intensive, whether you're talking about crude oil, where you're digging out mud and boiling it to get some oil out of it, or fracking. So when you're looking at extractive industries, who benefits and who pays? We all benefit from this if it drives down the price of fuel and we drive cars. But again, someone's going to have to clean up this mess, and this used to be boreal forest. So there was a community, they probably did not want this to happen, and from a social justice perspective, why did that voice lose that argument? Backing up, natural gas. Natural gas is, there's no free lunch. We could call oil natural oil as well. All this stuff comes from dissolved organic material. This is just a fracking pond. Natural gas, there are a lot of benefits to it, especially when blended with renewables. It's helping drive coal out of the US power grid. And if you had to pick your poison, I'd rather have natural gas on the grid than coal, if you study the issue. However, this is what fracking looks like when it's not properly regulated. A really interesting Rolling Stone article recently, if you want to do some additional research on this, about Vernal, Utah, and just the local impact in the community. So again, we all benefit. The lights are on, we drive our cars. The local community where the energy was extracted, they pay an unfair price for this. And they tend not to have much of a voice. And sometimes their local governments will actually legislate to overrule them. There's been state-level legislation that's prevented municipalities from zoning for things like fracking and unconventional oil production. So energy is a good thing, we need energy, but if this was your backyard, if this was next to your farm or your ranch, you would have a big issue with this. So, climate change from the perspective of inequality. Hurricane Katrina, I think, is a really tragic microcosm, if you will, of how climate change can work. Hurricane Katrina was not caused by climate change. Again, climate change doesn't cause weather. But climate change does cause more frequent extreme weather and more intense extreme weather. So you have more Hurricane Sandys, more Hurricane Katrinas. And what happens when you have extreme weather? When we look at the case of Hurricane Katrina, it's an incredible tragedy. Worst loss of human life in a natural disaster in almost 100 years. Very, very serious. I think it was nearly 2,000 people, lives were lost there. But if you look at the impact of it from a social justice perspective, who got out of the way of that storm? The people who got out of the way of that storm had personal mobility. From a transit perspective, New Orleans was short 1,500 transit buses. So even after a mandatory evacuation order was given, there was no physical way to move the people out of the way of this. So then you follow Hurricane Katrina up with Deepwater Horizon, which was the most expensive corporate disaster. So really a 1-2 punch to some of the poorest communities in the Gulf Coast. Again, these communities that have lower levels of wealth and income, they benefit the least from extractive energy, and they tend to pay the highest price. So if you put this at a global level, and you have more storms, more extreme weather, the penalties of climate change are going to be a major social justice issue. That's why you're seeing nations lobbying today for funds to go between developed and developing countries, because the developed countries primarily have benefited from this, and the developing countries, especially in the global south, are going to see the most of this. On a local level, if we could wave a magic wand and climate change didn't exist, we'd still have the problem of local air quality. And we were worried about this long before anyone understood the effects of global climate change. This is just 2010 diesel health impacts in the United States. Staggering numbers. Premature deaths, 21,000, lung cancer deaths, 3,000. I mean, just diesel alone puts this premature death problem on the level of car accidents and gun violence in the US. Globally, air pollution is one of the leading causes of premature death. In the developing world, you don't really have the rich country diseases that we experience in the developed world, but you have a lot of respiratory illnesses, and it's entirely caused by how we're burning things to move vehicles or to create industrial output. I'm more optimistic about our ability to clean up the power grid than I am transportation. Transportation is really hard. If you look at the progress we've made on lowering the carbon intensity of the grid, we're We're making a lot of progress. We are not moving fast enough on transportation. And if you look at this map, again, a lot of these questions are about fairness. When you drill into these boxes, what you find is that the poorest communities live near the oil refineries, they live near the ports, they live near the 8-lane freeways. Sometimes we put the 8-lane freeways through the poorest communities because it's the easiest place to get the permits. So when you look at the impact of just the local emissions, the cargo that we move across this country, if you order something from Amazon, my family does its best to help the local economy in Amazon, but the delivery of those goods, the freight corridors, we don't live near those corridors. So again, who benefits, who pays? And the bottom line is the lowest income communities tend to pay the highest price. So you put in an oil refinery, you put in a chemical plant, and the families that can afford to leave do. Or families that can afford no other housing tend to move to those neighborhoods. So in this country, pollution tends to discriminate. People either move away from it or they're forced to move to it. And at the same time, the poorest communities are the least energy intensive communities. They are not the ones keeping Amazon Prime humming along or driving large SUVs. This is another example of it. This is just drilling into school buses. I think when we look back, transporting children in diesel school buses is going to be one of the worst ideas we have, the more we learn about diesel pollution. A lot of pollution leaks back into the cabin of a school bus. Again, a lot of attention on the VW issue with cheating on diesel emissions, but it turns out our older school buses are 8 times dirtier than the Volkswagen cars that cheated on the emissions testing. And of course, from an equality perspective, the brand new school buses are in the most affluent school districts, and often those school districts sell their used equipment or lease it out. So you have 250,000 school buses on the road that don't even meet the existing air quality regulation, and you can predict where you're going to find those school buses. So exposing school-age children to diesel exhaust, very, very dangerous criteria pollutant, a known carcinogen. My last comment here, in China, we read headlines about dirty air in China. A lot of attention-grabbing articles. And in China, it is a national problem. If you've ever been to China, Beijing or Shanghai, you cannot get away from it, with the exception of some restaurants that are now starting to charge extra for you to sit indoors in filtered air. So it's very easy for us to criticize developing economies and look at how dirty it is there. What we do in the US is we disperse the pollution. So we have a lot more mobility. The most ironic example of this, there was a coal company CEO who, after finishing a successful career of mountaintop removal mining in West Virginia, retired to Laguna Beach, California. So extractive industry in West Virginia, a lot of long-term consequences, and then when the resources are gone, move to a place that hasn't been trashed. So there's got to be a better way. And there is. We're finding that it's entirely possible, especially in sectors like electricity, to generate energy from renewable, from sustainable sources. This is solar PV, and there's a lot of solar photovoltaic going on around you. In fact, your local transit system in Moline has a solar photovoltaic system. So they're already improving the sustainability of their electricity. In the long term, again, I'm much more optimistic about our ability to decarbonize the electrical grid. And if some of my presentation was gloom and doom and makes you concerned about climate change, things are heading in a good direction. There are a lot of positive trends. Probably the most important thing that has happened to slow down climate change is the fact that a couple years ago, 50% of our electricity came from coal, and it's already down to 35%. And if you've studied climate change, coal is the single biggest issue in terms of slowing down climate change. So keeping coal on the ground, not burning it, best thing we can do. And a lot of work is being done here. Wind, solar, these technologies are already cheaper than fossil fuels, unsubsidized in a lot of locations. So that's why solar is a booming industry. In fact, from a jobs perspective, there are more people working in the solar industry in the United States right now than there are in the coal sector. We have solar on our home in California, and one of the really great things about it is when we put the system on, a lot of local workers, contractors, electricians were involved in installing our system. So instead of spending money on a commodity that was going to be burned, go up a smokestack and make our air dirtier, we help families in our local community. The money multiplier effect. So renewable energy, a lot of great things about it. One of the biggest ones from a social justice perspective is it creates high quality technical jobs. Just to put some numbers behind how fast this is going, in 2014, a new solar system in the US was installed every 2.5 minutes. That's really awesome. One of those solar systems in 2014 was your Moline transit system. In California, we've got a target to get to 50% renewable electricity by 2030. Hawaii's called for 100% renewable electricity. I think San Diego's going for 100%. Paris climate talks surprisingly went really well. So we're going to see the grid clean up very fast. And now that solar is cheaper than fossil fuel in a lot of places, the growth will be exponential. So this is really good news. So a lot of solar, a lot of clean electricity, we got to get it into cars. Where I started my career on the clean vehicle side was on the car sector with Tesla Motors. And there are a lot of cars, gave VW some criticism, so we'll show when they're electric vehicles. There's actually a really great proposal right now that suggests that rather than VW repairing the diesel vehicles, that they actually put the money into zero-emission vehicle technology and deploy enough electric vehicles to make up for diesel. I think that's a really good idea. So lots of great electric vehicles. In December of 2015, we had an all-time sales record in terms of electric vehicle sales. 300,000 electric vehicles sold globally last year, over 1 million on the road. But from a social justice perspective, I'm not sure that the BMW X5 e-Drive is going to provide equality of mobility. But the good news is we've cracked this problem on the car side. The horse is out of the barn. Electric vehicles are going to continue to take market share, and they'll keep moving down to the lower price points. Fiat and my alma mater, Tesla Motors, great photo of the Model S in front of probably Highway 1 in California. The problem is this is a luxury good, and in a lot of ways, even a car itself is the ultimate luxury good. The Chevy Bolt, which is an electric vehicle I'm very excited about, they've announced it'll be roughly $37,000 before tax credit, so maybe just under 30. There are a lot of families in the US and globally that can't afford a car at all. A lot of families in the US who buy used cars as their first car. So how are we going to get electric vehicle technology into everyone's hands faster than just providing new cars? So back to transit. Bus transit really is the backbone of the urban core, and the problem with transit buses, if you've spent time around them, they're loud, they're dirty, they're very heavy, they're unreliable. 1 in 5 transit buses in the US is parked on any given day for maintenance. Turns out diesel engines don't like to stop and start 500 times a day. And it's incredibly energy inefficient. When you see a transit bus and there's 1 or 2 people on it and it's burning a quarter gallon of fuel per mile, not a great use of energy. So our company, Proterra, what we've been working on is reimagining transit technology. We think transit vehicles in the long term, if you think about what are cities going to be like in the future, if you watched a sci-fi movie, we think they're going to be zero emission, not low emission, zero emission. The reason for that is every city we know of needs to lower its population load, or its pollution load caused by its population load. So we are way, way, way beyond what we should be emitting from a pollution perspective. The long-term solution should be zero emission. We think these vehicles should be quiet. Noise pollution, again, disproportionately affects communities. We think they should be lightweight, highly reliable, and extremely energy efficient. In terms of extremely energy efficient, our internal goal is to have our electric bus be 10 times more energy efficient than the next best alternative, which is a natural gas bus. 10x energy efficiency is huge. I have not seen that type of efficiency gain in other sectors with the exception of maybe LED lighting. So the goal is EV for everyone. 40-foot, 35-foot transit buses are ubiquitous. You find them all over the world. They're an enormous sector, and they're really your basic rung of your transportation infrastructure. We think if we can get EV technology into buses, it is available to everyone. And we also think we can improve the image, the interest in taking zero-emission vehicles. We've seen examples, Southern California, for one, where individual vehicle drivers who drove a Toyota Prius to work stopped driving a Prius because they could ride on a full electric vehicle. And it was the bus. but it gave them access to an electric vehicle, which they thought was greener than even a Prius. So one question we often get is, well, aren't you just shifting tailpipe emissions to a smokestack? Aren't you just going from tailpipe to power plant? The energy's got to come from somewhere. The important thing is that the energy efficiency of an electric motor is so much better than a heavy combustion engine that we're cutting the energy consumption per mile by 80%. So even if we ran the grid entirely on oil, which we don't in the US or even in most countries, you'd still be cutting your emissions by 80%. Electric motors are just a much better way to generate low-speed stop-start movement. And then once you've flipped over to electricity, you've got a diverse fuel mix. So these charts show where your electricity comes from in the US and California and in the Pacific Northwest. The latter two are some of our biggest markets. But you can see renewables, hydroelectric electricity, nuclear, those are all no-carbon sources of electricity. You're looking at an 86% to 90% well-to-wheel carbon reduction. So when cities are looking for 50% CO2 reductions, this type of technology could overshoot that, which is very important. Bottom line, we think that if you combine bus transit systems with electric vehicle technology, you get the lowest cost, lowest environmental impact for moving people in an urban environment. That is very important because if you want more access to transportation, you need more transit. If you need more transit, it's a dollars and cents thing. There are only so many tax dollars to go around. There's only so much additional grant funding you can get for transit. So we've got to make transit more productive. We've got to make it cheaper. And at the same time, we've got to make it more environmentally productive, more efficient. So more transit, less pollution. The point of this is to show that this is happening, and it's happening in a diverse set of markets. This is not a blue state or a red state phenomenon. We have electric buses in California. We've got them in the Pacific Northwest. That's not incredibly surprising, given the politics of those states and climate objectives. But we've got electric buses in Texas. We've got electric buses in Florida. There's a recent controversy in Florida as to whether or not state employees were allowed to talk about climate change, and we're deploying electric buses. We've got buses in Massachusetts. We've got them in Louisville. We've got them in Nashville. We've got them in South Carolina. And we've got a one-year backlog, so we will be shipping vehicles to Minnesota. We're shipping them to Dallas, Texas. So the technology, every city's the same. They want less pollution, they want more mobility. So we're very proud of the fact that this is not a partisan issue. It's not a great idea to burn diesel fuel where you live, and it doesn't really matter what your politics are. So we're excited to help purple states, blue states, green states, red states get this done. And longer term, we hope to go global with this technology as well. I like this slide a lot just because it shows how much pride the cities that we work with take in this technology. A lot of times people don't necessarily dress up or call attention to the new diesel buses. In fact, a lot of communities protest when a new bus is going to put a diesel, or a new route is going to put diesel buses right into their neighborhood. In this case, this is Florida, Southern California, that's San Antonio, Texas in the middle, Reno, Nevada, and San Joaquin RTD, that's Stockton, California, the northern part of the California Central Valley. What's really exciting is this is how all of these communities and cities chose to show off the technology that they had deployed. They're all talking about it in different ways. Foothill Transit, which is in LA County, it's very much a green environmental theme. San Antonio and Reno, it's about energy, it's about technology. But the bottom line is these cities, these local communities, they want to show off the fact that they've invested in high-tech, sustainable transportation technology. This is a good thing. We need to make the buses a cool way to get to work. We need to show communities that use buses that we value them. And we need to get more people out of cars and into buses. This is just an example of fast charging systems we deploy. This is in Stockton, California. That white overhead unit, that's a 10-minute fast charger. So the bus can pull up, automatically recharge while the passengers are loading and unloading. This is Louisville, Kentucky. Again, a community taking a lot of pride, really wanting to show off their zero-emission transit vehicles. They've deployed 10 of these, and they run them in their downtown circulator. The mayor of Louisville, Kentucky has talked about creating a diesel-free downtown. So that's really exciting. That really sends a message to a community that we care about their local health, and hopefully drives more people into transit vehicles and very clean transit vehicles. So that's what Proterra is about. I don't want to make this too much of a sales pitch. I don't think many of you are in the market for a transit bus. You need a very large family to take advantage of one. But I don't think it's far off before you experience these. So in terms of your choices, how you get to work, how you plan your life, down the road as this technology deploys, check it out. And if you want to learn more about transit, talk to your local transit operation. You've actually got a couple of great transit systems in the Quad Cities area, and I think the Quad Cities is a great example of these new urban areas that are interested in getting rid of diesel buses and getting access to electric vehicle technology. But as I was thinking about it, and in terms of helping you think about how environmental sustainability ties to social justice, these are just a couple of the subtopics. I think the first one is obviously local environmental impact. And if you're interested in social justice and you're looking for opportunities within the field, look at extractive industries. Extractive industries, they're not all bad. They provide a tremendous amount of benefit to our society. I mean, our electric vehicles, there are metals in the battery packs that come from mining operations, like nickel, like zinc, cobalt. And we need to keep an eye on our supply chain. Extractive industries tend to have very similar problems. And I think one of the reasons why you see fairness issues with extractive industries, whether it's oil, whether it's mining, is when you look at the factors of production. So if you're business and econ folks in here, you should know what those are. It's fairly easy to dominate an extractive industry with capital. So once you get to be the biggest, you can take advantage of some of the other factors of production, i.e. labor or land, which tend to be the little guy. The opposite of that is what you see in the high-tech field, where you've got a lot of entrepreneurship. That's one of the 4 factors of production. Where entrepreneurship is very important, where creativity is very important, you tend to have more fairness. You tend to have more mobility. If you don't like your job, and entrepreneurship is a key part of it, you go and start your own thing. So if you work at a mine in Africa, or you work in an oil field as a third country national in the Middle East, you're going to find some social justice issues. And again, it's because of the ability for one factor of production to dominate the other. A great historical example of this is the California gold rush. A lot of people think that 49ers came out and made a bunch of money on gold. The profits from the gold rush were accumulated to a small group of corporations and entities within just a few short years. So the early discoveries in the gold rush made a few folks rich, but once the claims were consolidated and you needed heavy capital, you had subsistence gold mining in California. So you had people, ironically, mining gold at the poverty line. And it's because once you consolidate it to a small group of people, it's very easy to move labor in and out and pay them less. So a lot of social justice issues with extractive industries. Global environmental impact, again, climate change is probably one of the biggest social justice, environmental justice challenges we have, and no one has any easy answers on this. What do you say to an island nation in the Pacific that goes away? That's a pretty hard one to solve. Fairness and externalities, again, tying back to economics. Emissions are one of the biggest externalities we found in economics. And an externality is something that you don't directly pay for. So we benefit from driving our SUVs, but we're not necessarily the one who pays for the externality. Fourth one here, environmental root cause. If you're spending a lot of time on social justice issues and you're spending a lot of time on symptoms, if you're looking at intractable long-term problems in communities, just take a look at what the environmental drivers may be. What's the air quality like there? What are the property values like? What's the water quality like? Again, in the US, we have a lot of mobility. Our most affluent tend to escape this problem. Our least well-off tend to get trapped by it. And these environmental root causes that lead to health problems can perpetuate poverty. And then finally, multi-generational challenges. This is the perpetuation problem. When you look at health impacts, especially from environmental emissions, you can hurt multiple generations. So you have a family living in an area that's got poor air quality, you're putting those kids on old school buses. You can see how you really start stacking the deck against a community. Last one, and then I'll wrap up, just some quick thoughts on what you can do. You don't necessarily have to work in a field that matters to you, but just remember that your choices add up. The companies that sell you things, they care a tremendous amount about your generation in particular. So what you prefer, even at the margin, drives a lot of their decisions. The second one on here, work for companies that are actually focused on sustainability. Right now, you'll tend to find that that's smaller companies. They tend to be startups, younger companies. But what you can also do is you can work for a large company and you can get that company to care about sustainability. So you can be a change agent within a large company. You don't necessarily have to graduate and go work for Tesla or Nest or Solar City. You may go work for an electric utility, and you could be that employee there that spearheads a project to get them that next renewable asset online. In your spare time or full time, you can work for a nonprofit. Nonprofits have become incredibly powerful in the environmental sector. The one I would highlight is the Sierra Club. If you want to read an inspiring story, read about the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. They, in the last 5 to 10 years, probably have had more to do to influence sustainability than any other nonprofit on the electrical side. So entities like the Sierra Club, they have really taken a leadership position in terms of fighting climate change. Obviously, public sector, public office. For any professors in the audience, you can incorporate sustainability into your curriculum because you have the next generation of leaders. You got 4 years with them, maybe 5. So that's it. Then they're off and they're working and they're making an impact. And then the last thing I leave you with here, and this is something I didn't fully understand until I looked back on some of the things I had done. Don't ever underestimate the impact you have, and for good and for bad. So if you're working on a project that you don't believe in, or you're working for a company that fundamentally you don't value, you are adding a lot of value. All of you in this room going to this college, you have a lot of talent. You can do a lot of good, you can do a lot of harm. So if you're working on something and it seems really difficult, but you believe in it, you will look back a couple of years ago, or a couple of years from now, and you'll be really surprised at how much of an impact it had. We were slogging away at Tesla from 2007 to 2009 during the Great Recession, and electric cars seemed like a crazy idea. We were putting battery packs into the back of Lotus Elises, not exactly a practical two-seater. And today, Tesla's at a run rate of, I think, 50,000 cars a year. Last time I visited their factory in the East Bay, they were exporting some of the cars to Germany. That gave me goosebumps, the idea that an American company could sell luxury cars in Germany, Daimler, BMW country. I thought that era was over in the United States. And even more important, Tesla catalyzed, it triggered a competitive response from companies that probably wouldn't have jumped into the electric vehicle space. So it's a little bit like Yoda, there is no try, there is no middle ground. You're not gonna have neutrality in your career. So you gotta, if you can't see it, if you can't figure out whether it adds value or it doesn't add value, that's a bad sign. So find a way to have a positive impact. It will be bigger than you think. You won't see it in the moment. Sorry, one more. We pulled this at work for you. I work in the clean tech space. A lot of people think green technology, clean tech, that stuff's going on the left coast in California. But we looked at the index for sustainability jobs in the US. Illinois is in the top 10 at 61.5 out of an index of 100. Minnesota's at 49.2, Wisconsin 42, Iowa at 40. So if something happens at the border there, Iowa's going to have to step it up just a bit. But from where you are right here, just regionally, you have a lot of great clean tech careers. There are a lot of things going on in agriculture, in the power sector. Solar is going up all over the place. So if you're inspired by environmental justice, environmental technology, you can come out and see us in California, but you can also probably have quite an impact, quite a career right here at home. And you should be really proud of the fact that this region, all 4 of your closest large cities are in the top half of this index. So again, thank you very much for the time. Enjoy taking any questions you have.
Thank you for the presentation. This is a comment leading to a question. At the beginning, you talked about sort of differentiating between suburban and urban areas. And we drive to Chicago, and it's the whole city, it's the whole metropolitan area. And you said that people are kind of leaving suburbs and going to the center city. They're not going so much to the suburbs. But it seems to me the suburbs are with us. The big corporations have their offices there. There's zillions of people in the suburbs. Are you really saying that the suburbs are going to disappear and it's all going to be in the center with huge high 100-story towers? Or can you integrate the whole suburban and urban area, the whole metropolitan area will become the area that you work with your cleaner energy, better transportation?
Yeah, I don't think the suburbs are going away, but one of the challenges you do have with the suburbs is the suburb moves. I grew up west of Chicago in Elgin, and at the time, Elgin, Illinois was sort of the farthest west of sort of the connected Chicago metropolitan area. Now that area has continued to move west, and Elgin doesn't occupy the same place that it did before in terms of being the newest suburb where you can buy that new home and that new development. So I don't think the suburbs are going away. When I flew into Chicago last night and looked out the window, you can see the carpet of the urban landscape that extends west for as far as the eye can see. But what we are seeing is from knowledge workers in particular, your people that are forming companies, they are gravitating more and more towards the urban core. That trend is probably most apparent in places like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but you're seeing it in Chicago as well. So I don't have a crystal ball on it, but I think the risk of suburbs is it's very easy for the next suburb to displace the existing suburb. Whereas the urban core, New York is New York, Chicago is Chicago. And so the infrastructure investments tend to be more permanent, and the jobs tend to be more permanent. So it's a challenging problem. For transit systems, suburbs are really tricky. We built the suburbs around the highway system. We built them around very cheap fuel and fuel that had no environmental consequence. There's also the trend of autonomous and what it's going to mean for the suburbs. And there are two very smart, educated schools of thought. One thinks that self-driving cars are going to get everybody back into cities because cities are going to get a lot more convenient. And the other thinks that it's going to drive extreme suburbanization because in the morning you can brew your cup of coffee, grab your New York Times, and your self-driving car deals with the 90 minutes of driving while you get work done. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I do know that economically, though, your best bet as a worker is to get into the urban core. Suburbs tend to be a one-trick pony, and when that corporation moves to the next cheapest suburb or the state that gives them the best tax incentives, there's no safety net for that suburb. So it's a challenging problem to solve if somebody moves that suburb's reason for being there.
Question over here.
It's quicker.
You've addressed the concerns about inner city and suburbia, well, the intercity transportation. And I'm curious about intra-city transportation. The highway system, of course, is degraded. We're very different than Europe, and many people use train systems to travel throughout Europe. Do you see any change in the future about long distance travel? And maybe it's not even a concern, but how much long distance traveling is being done, and will new technology help?
Well, we're seeing the capability of zero-emission technology go up very, very quickly. And two things are changing very fast. The range that you can go on a specific amount of energy storage and how quickly you can recharge batteries. So we're now seeing electric vehicles that can go 200, 300 miles on a single charge. Our company's taken this vehicle over 250 miles on the test track on a single charge. I don't know that it's 3 years away, but maybe it's not 10 years away to see these types of heavy-duty electric drivetrains go into trucks and long-range buses, especially when you combine fast charge technology. We tend to stay focused on kind of the 80-20 of the problem, though, in that we look at where 80% of the people live, 80% of the energy is used, and if we could get urban transportation off of fossil fuels, so if we had our buses, our personal cars, our delivery trucks, off of fossil fuels, we'd have more than enough carbon budget, even if we couldn't solve the problem of planes, trains, and long-range trucks. That being said, you create a huge fairness issue. In California, the California Central Valley is the worst air quality in our state. That's driven by agriculture, geography, and the fact there are truck corridors running through there. So all that cargo that goes into Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, it gets on trucks, and you can look at a heat map, and it just runs through the same communities. So, as you said, the U.S. is very different. The rail projects in the U.S. have been harder to execute. They compete against things like regional airlines like Southwest. That is hard. It's tough to compete against things like Southwest and JetBlue. It's fast. It's relatively cheap. I do think, though, there is a potential for electric vehicles and long-range transportation. Just like with cars, though, it's a pretty small fraction of trips, but you've got the fairness issue that our freight corridors are some of our dirtiest environments in our country, and if we don't get this technology into some long-range vehicles, we won't be able to fix that problem.
Okay, we have time for one last question, so you get the last word there.
What are your thoughts on nuclear fusion, and do you think that could ever be applied to like something like a transit system, or like maybe just cars, like, or maybe what you said, like going from urban center to urban center?
So I think that the challenge that some of the kind of higher cost, higher tech sources of energy are having right now is how inexpensive and simple other forms of clean energy are getting. Small scale nuclear, and there are some startups that are doing some interesting work around it, is very interesting. It's used in naval vessels, aircraft carriers, things like that. They have onboard reactors. I don't know if you'd see it in vehicles this small, but the nuclear sector, the nuclear electricity sector in the U.S. is really struggling, and one of the reasons it's struggling is it's so much faster and cheaper to do a solar or a wind project and then back it up with a natural gas plant when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. What we're seeing is, as industries get bigger, costs keep coming down, and solar and batteries and wind, they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when a project developer is trying to figure out the lowest cost of green electricity, nuclear is really having trouble competing right now. I don't know that we'll see another nuclear plant built in the US, maybe we will, but if solar keeps going on the trend line that it is, I think we're more likely to see a trend that we call distributed energy, which is where as you build new buildings, your permitting process might require that you install enough solar or you do energy efficient windows and lighting that you don't need more central power. So long term, I think it's simple, I think it's cheap, I think it's green, and I think we're going to be putting more energy generation close to where we use it, which is, I think, one of the benefits you could have from small-scale fusion. But I'm very excited about the combination of solar and electric vehicle technology, because it's easy to generate the power where you're going to refuel the vehicle, and if you can do that, you cut all the waste of the transmission and distribution.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.